All right. I want to welcome everyone for coming out to this webinar today to discuss a little bit about tips for getting into graduate school. Before we get started, I wanted to introduce myself. I'm Dr. Ted Cross. I'm an assistant clinical professor of leadership here at the Thunderbird School of Global Business, and I'm also the academic director for the Master of Applied Leadership and Management program. And I've had a lot of experience with working in higher education as an admissions officer, as a program director of various types, and teaching, of course. And I thought I would share with you some tips that I think are important to putting together a really good graduate application. Along the way, as we are going through this presentation, sort of the rough format is 25 to 30 minutes of material presentation. Going to leave some question time at the end. But along the way, if you have questions, please feel free to chat it in the box or raise your hand using the raising your hand feature. Becca will be helping me along the way, and she is a co-host with me for this webinar, and she can also answer any of your questions after the webinar is over via email or phone call, so she'd be glad to talk with you about that. So I'd like to welcome everyone out and like to give you a little bit of an overview of what we're going to cover today. And that's on my objectives page. And there's really 4 things we want to go over. First, I want to explain a little bit about this idea of fit with a graduate program. So how do you make sure that the program's right for you and you're right for the program? I think that's very important. I'll explain why. Second, we'll go over a few characteristics of really great admissions essays. Sometimes these are called personal statements, and that is important to understand in order to put forward a good application that shows who you really are as a candidate. Third, we get this question a lot about, what if I have a lower GPA than some of the other applicants? How do I overcome that? So we'll give a few tips there. And last, almost every graduate application requires that you have a polished resume. So just a couple tips for resumes. We've all been to these resume writing workshops, and I just want to point out a few things that will be helpful in the graduate application context. Sometimes a resume is called a CV or a curriculum vitae, and we'll discuss more about that also. So to begin, don't be scared with my denied icon here, but I wanted to tell you a story to get started from my own personal experience applying for graduate school. In 2009, I was graduating from a master's degree. I was ready to apply to doctoral programs around the country, and so I started applying for a lot of doctoral programs in organizational behavior. And as I did that, I was filling out the applications. Everything was seeming to be in order. I had my letters of recommendation and all those different aspects that I needed. I was confident. I applied to, I think, maybe 5 or 6 doctoral programs in organizational leadership. I sent in the applications, and a little bit towards, I think it was the fall of 2009, I was rejected by every single one of those prestigious and fine programs. And I was sort of, miffed. How did I get rejected by every program I had applied to? And really what I started to realize stepping back is there was a number of factors going into why I wasn't getting into these schools. Number one was situational. It was 2009 and we were in the bottom of a recession, and what was happening was lots of applicants were coming back to school who had been in the workforce for a long time, and so there was increased competition. So that was one thing that was out of my control. The second thing was in my control, and that was I was applying to organizational behavior programs, and I probably would have done a lot better if I had applied to leadership doctoral programs. And so the fit of my background really wasn't meshing well with my goal to get into an organizational behavior doctoral program. I should have been looking more at the leadership aspect of doctoral programs. So took 1 year off, went back to work, and then reapplied to programs again in 2010, I guess it was, 2011. and was then accepted to several programs that round and went into the leadership category. Now, the reason that I bring that up is not to say, you can't get into graduate school the first time. No, what I'm saying is learn from my mistakes, which is that I didn't think about program fit as closely or as thoroughly as I should have at the beginning of my search and application process. So there's really a couple things we want to consider as far as program fit. And the first one is that it's really about figuring out which program is the best for you. So it's about selecting the right program. And there's two main things you really need to look at in order to determine not only one, do I like this program? Would I be interested in this? Is it a prestigious program from my perspective? But also, does my past work experience or academic experience match with my future goals and what the program has to offer? So you're really looking to see, wow, can I take what I've already learned, build on it in this program, and how would that lead to my future career goals or academic goals? So that's really what the program officer is looking for. The missions officer is saying, look, I'm looking to see if you would want, if I would want you to come into this program. Number one, are you someone that I would want to have in a program for 2 to 3 or 4 years? It's kind of like choosing someone to work for you, right? Like, do you want them around for 2 to 3 or 4 years? And then the second one is, are they a match for us? Is the application's aspirations in line with what we offer in this program, and does it make sense given their recent background history and also sort of previous work experience? Now, the last caveat I have on this slide is to say that this does not mean that unconventional backgrounds, so let's say that you have a bachelor in fine arts and you want to go to business school, that won't work. I'm not saying that that's the case, but what I'm saying is you need to make sure that if you have some sort of unconventional background, that you're showing how, or you're thinking at least about how that fits into the program that you're going after. And then later what we'll talk about is how you would explain those connections. So fit is really important because, one, you're choosing the program that you want to apply to, and learning from my story that I told, make sure that it's really in the right area and that you kind of meet the qualifications to get into that program, and then making sure it matches with your long-term goals so that the admissions officer can see that you would belong or you would fit in that program. So that's what, you hear a lot about program fit. That's really what the admissions officers are looking for. The second thing I want to go over, and feel free to send any questions in the chat box as I'm going, and I'll try to pick those up as we go, is that not only do you have to have a good fit for the program, select the right program, now almost every single graduate application that I have seen requires an admissions essay, or sometimes what they call a personal statement. Now, I have a picture here of some folks meeting, and the reason I put that there is that the admissions essay or the personal statement is really taking the place of in-person interviews. So in some programs still, even in some of our programs here at Thunderbird, there is some sort of interview process. For other programs, like the Master of Applied Leadership and Management, there's too many applicants, so we need to use admissions essays to look at taking the place of a personal interview. And so lots and lots of graduate schools rely heavily on the admissions essay to make decisions about admitting students. And you need to think of that essay really as a proxy for a personal interview, and so you need to write it in that kind of a way. So on the next couple slides, what I want to show you are some sample introductory paragraphs from a few student essays, real student essays, for getting into different types of graduate school. And I had worked with some of these students in the past, but I want to show you sort of like their different ways that they started their essays. And then at the end, I'm going to ask a question about what you notice throughout these 3 different examples. But first, I want to show those to you. So here's an example of Rebecca. She was applying to a physician's assistant graduate school. And this is how she started her essay. "How has your day been?" I asked. Mary paused, clutching her bag, considering her response. She had come for an alopecia follow-up, something pretty routine in a dermatology clinic. But the answer I received wasn't what I was expecting. "You know what?" she said after a long pause. "It has been very bad." So that's her introductory paragraph to her personal statement or admissions essay. Let me show you 2 more. Second one is from John. He was applying to an MBA program. And he wrote, "My purpose and intent in applying to the MBA program is to advance my knowledge and skill sets, which will allow me to provide increased future value for the individuals and companies with whom I will be associated throughout my life. This confidence is rooted in what can be characterized as my nearly insatiable desire to grow and constantly improve." So that's John's introductory paragraph. And this last one is from Reynolds. He was applying for dental school. And the reason I'm showing you 3 different types is because I think that what I'm talking about here and will reiterate applies to lots of different types of graduate school. So Reynolds writes, "The usual smell of smoke from burning trash, charcoal, and bricks blanketed the cool morning air. The sounds of Madagascar were in their regular morning rhythms. Roosters clucked and crowed as old imported French CO2 meat wagons screeched and backfired, and local door-to-door vendors advertised their products through song." So those are the 3 admissions essays that I wanted to show you, but the real question is what happened with these students? So here's some results or some outcomes. Rebecca, as you remember, was talking about working in a medical clinic and had been applying to physician's assistant school, was accepted into Duke. John, the MBA applicant, was rejected and he might reapply. Reynolds was accepted into dental school after having been rejected multiple times before he reworked his essay. So I would ask you, what are the differences between Rebecca and Reynolds' essays and John's essay? Now let me put back up just John's. Here's John's. Remember, he says, "My purpose and intent in applying to the MBA program is to advance my knowledge and skill sets." Okay, just keep that in your mind for a second. And contrast that with Rebecca, who starts off by saying, "How was your day?" and tells about the clinic, and Reynolds, "The usual smell of smoke from burning trash." So what do you all think are the differences between what Rebecca and Reynolds did versus what John, the MBA student, did? And looks like I have some people typing. Thank you. And feel free just to take a couple moments to type some responses. So Eileen says Rebecca was able to connect her personal experience with the program. Very good, yeah. So Rebecca is showing, look, I worked in the medical field and I had personal experience with patients, and that's the kind of program I am attempting to apply to, and so there's a great fit, right? Showing a great fit there. Okay, let's see. Anita, Reynolds is a storyteller, not so much related to the context of the program. True. So even though Reynolds isn't talking about working in a dental clinic and he's applying to dentistry school, he is telling a really good story. And what happens is that I, as the reader, especially as an admissions officer, am interested in continuing to read that admissions essay. And as I get sucked into that story, he's explaining later on, hopefully, how he fits for a dental program. And one more, let's see, we have another one here. Rebecca has given a real life scenario. Yep, a real life scenario that she's in. And John's objective is a routine introduction. Yeah, so one thing, let's go back to, that's a great point. Let's go back and look at John's really quick. John is just listing stuff, right? And he's using a lot of buzzwords. So my purpose in applying is advanced knowledge, use skill sets, increase future value, and just sort of like listing things. I need to ask a good question. What's wrong with just a routine introduction? And my answer to that is that, well, if there's lots and lots of admissions essays that are in front of an admissions officer, you want to make sure that they continue to read yours and that you really stand out. And that's why I recommend that everybody starts with a story, a personal story that connects to your experience and then shows how you will use that experience in a master's program and then continuing on into your career. But the difference between using a story and just using sort of a routine introduction really, in my experience, has made the difference between people being admitted and people not being admitted, especially in these examples that I just showed you. These are real students that I worked with. John wasn't willing to take my advice on writing a story. He just wanted to write his standard MBA sort of introduction, and he was rejected. And then Rebecca and Reynolds, of course, names are changed, were willing to go ahead and try a story, even in Reynolds' case, if he had to sort of tangentially make it related to dental school and then explain how it connected to dental school later on in the essay. Using a story was enough to garner interest from the admissions officer and then get him over the admissions hurdle, even though he had been rejected other times with sort of routine essays in the past. Let's see, we had another question. Rebecca and Reynolds demonstrated creative thinking. That's true. So those essays also do demonstrate creative thinking, and they show that you can tell a personal story. And one thing, especially in business school, that's important is being able to communicate well. And it's showing a different skill set than maybe some of the other students. So there's some contrasting. Any other questions before we continue on to our other topics? Oh, and I do want to mention, we do have a webinar that focuses only on that essay writing piece. We can send a recording out of that, and we'll probably run another session in a month or two. Question about typical length of an essay. It depends. Some of the essay prompts, depending on the school, are broken up into multiple questions. So there'll be a question and then a box, and it'll tell you how many characters or how many words you're allowed to put in that box. Others, the more common one, is that they will have one prompt that has multiple questions in it and ask you to write about a page, usually, in response to that as a personal statement. Question about, what about putting charts or graphs into your admissions essay? What I would say is that the admissions essay is less about quantifying your accomplishments and more about using story and prose and narrative to tell a story. We'll talk a little bit more about quantifying in the resume later, and that might be a better place to use graphics. But you're really trying to tell a story. You could, unless you're a really good graphic designer, I'd probably leave out graphics and just figure out a way to tell a really good story. Another question, are there types of personal stories that work better than others? So this is a great question. I've seen lots of different types of personal stories work. I was explaining, I think in our last webinar on essay writing, that I saw an undergraduate admissions essay from a student who was admitted to every single Ivy League school. and they wrote their essay about going for a run. So they were a cross-country runner in high school, and they were going for a run, and sort of the whole admissions essay was told from the perspective of taking a jog around his hometown and sort of what he saw as he was jogging. So he would say, "Look, I'm turning the corner on Fifth Street, and there I see this homeless shelter, and here's the things that I think of when I pass that." And so he was doing kind of social commentary and revealing things about himself through a simple story of going for a jog in his hometown. So almost any story can work, but you are right that it needs to connect sort of to your overall aim of what you want to accomplish through the graduate program and sort of highlight some of your characteristics that would be a good fit for that program. And sometimes it's just showing, for example, the story about the dentist from Reynolds. What he's talking about is, living in Madagascar, and what he continues on later in his essay that I didn't show is that, he lived in Madagascar. He learned to live with a different culture than where he was from. And because of that, he learned to work with different types of people, and he realized that he wanted to be in the helping professions, and that led him to dentistry, right? So you got to show, yes, some sort of logical connections to get to there, but really it's important to get that hook up front with a story and then show how it connects. It doesn't have to be perfectly connected as you saw in Reynolds' example, but if you can, it is better. Okay, thank you guys for those questions. Here's the question we often get. How do I overcome a low GPA? And some might say, well, what's a low GPA to you? And it really depends on which program you're applying to. You can look at the stats of typical applicants and see, hey, is my GPA in the range of people who have been admitted? And if it's not, you might need to consider some of these tips to overcome a lower GPA. First, I want to say up front that if you have a low GPA, it's not the end of the world. It can be overcome. Lots of people think that it can't, but it really can. And so here's a few just really quick tips to think about. One is we just went over the admissions essay, and you might use the admissions essay as a way to explain why you have a low GPA. Now you don't want to sound too sort of desperate in this essay, but if your GPA is low, for example, because there was a medical event that happened during your undergraduate or some sort of life event that was sort of traumatic, why not use that as the story, which then helps explain, number one, who you are as a person and how well-rounded you are and your ability to overcome adversity. But second, also gives some insight into why your GPA might be a little bit lower. And so by using the admissions essay as a way to explain, you can sort of mitigate a lower GPA and help the admissions essay look at the total package that is you as an applicant. So that's one way to address things. Second is if the GRE or GMAT is required, and even if it's not required for a program, but you have a low GPA, you may consider sending in those standardized tests because it's another sort of academic data point for admissions officers to use in order to gauge sort of your aptitude to complete the graduate program at a high level. And so if you have a low GPA, you might consider submitting your GMAT or GRE scores in addition. And even if a program doesn't require those, if you have a low GPA, it doesn't hurt to put those scores in there. I see I have a question coming in, so let me see what that says. What carries more weight, previous undergrad or graduate GPA? So almost always undergraduate GPA carries more weight than graduate GPA. And the reason for that is that graduate GPAs, depending on program, can vary wildly. They're usually higher no matter what than undergraduate. And one of the reasons is that many graduate programs, if you get lower than a B, so I remember one graduate program I was in a master's degree, you could only get A's and B's. If you got a B, then you were sort of like you didn't pass the class. And if you did that twice, then you were on probation. And so sometimes students are expected to be in that A, B, or B minus sort of category. And so admissions officers give a lot less weight to the graduate GPA than the undergraduate. What is nice, and this is a good thing to think about, is that if you have a graduate GPA or you have a graduate a couple courses, if you don't have the whole graduate degree, can help show a story that, hey, I had a lower undergrad GPA, now I've gone into these graduate courses or graduate program and I did a lot better, and I've shown that I can actually do the work. So if in that instance I saw an applicant that had an undergraduate GPA that was low, and let's say they're an engineering student and they had a low undergraduate GPA, but they had a master's in electrical engineering and the GPA was higher, I would definitely take that into consideration. But overall, it's the undergraduate GPA. Okay, we're going to go on to our last area here, and then we'll open up for some more questions. And this is about writing your resume or your CV, your curriculum vitae. Most graduate applications do require that you have a resume on file. And this goes back to the question about should we insert graphics and tables into the admissions essay. And so what I'm arguing here is that the admissions essay is really taking the place of a personal interview. And so you want to use it to tell your story, who you are, create some interest in you as an applicant, and connect it to the program for that fit aspect. And the resume is about showing those professional and academic accomplishments or the highlights of your career. And a couple tips for that. First, make sure you do get someone else's eyes on it. That's just something we always say. Not just to look for typos, but also to make sure that you're conveying what you want to convey through your resume or your CV. So many times I think it's a good idea, after you've come up with a draft of your resume, hand it over to someone else and ask them a couple questions. What kind of person do you think I am based on my resume? What kind of accomplishments stand out to you? And what kind of aptitudes do you think I have based off of this resume? And so if you ask someone else to tell you those things, they will give you feedback and you can adjust, because often, once we've been writing our resume and our essays for so long, we don't really see what we're conveying anymore. And so having a couple other people look at it and tell you what they're perceiving, if they didn't know you, if they were just looking at a resume and they didn't know that it was Ted Cross's resume, what kind of impressions would they be getting, and then adjusting from there. I will say that it is good to keep it short because it is a resume, and remember, there's lots of applications, and so you want yours to stand out, and it tends to be, if it's longer, people are going to sort of lose interest. Now, a curriculum vitae often is longer than a resume, but even if you're using sort of the CV format, I would make sure to cut it down as much as possible. And this is another tip, is do skip the non-traditional formats. So I think, yeah, one question, sorry, let me stop here. What's the max length on a CV or a resume? And I really think you want to have 2 pages max. And if you can put the highlights of everything on 1 page, that's impressive. Number one, it shows that you can sort of distill down what's really important to present to someone. And also just from an ease of reading, that makes an important impression. You can leave off sort of a lot of the things from maybe, high school or your very beginning of your career if it's not really relevant, and then just sort of hit the highlights as you're going along. We do see sometimes these non-traditional formatted resumes coming in, maybe it has their headshot on it, some sort of graphic design. And again, what I'll say is, unless you are, sort of a really good graphic designer, I would skip that because sometimes it just doesn't come off really well. It can come off kind of cheesy. And so I would just stick with a traditional format unless you're a really great graphic designer or you're applying for some sort of design focused master's degree. That might be a reason to do non-traditional, but if it's not one of those types of programs, then I would shy away from that. Question, is it helpful to put a link to a LinkedIn profile for more details or background on a current and past jobs? Yeah, I think it is, and I think it's really good to put a link on your resume or CV that either goes to LinkedIn or About Me um, or maybe even if you have a personal web page or blog, that can be interesting too for people to look at. And Anita, yeah, let me repeat. I think the max length for for this context of applying to a graduate school is you don't want more than 2 pages for your resume or CV. And that's because you may lose people's interest, and it helps you sort of quantify and qualify everything into a single space instead of spreading it out over lots and lots of pages. So 2 pages. And the last tip here is quantify, quantify, quantify. And so I think Anita was mentioning this earlier, asking about the graphics and maybe some charts. I think the resume or the CV is the place to quantify every one of your accomplishments and to show people really what you have been able to do in your career or your academic career. And I think it's important to quantify even the accomplishments that you think aren't quantifiable. So let me give you an example here. And let me get out my pointer. Okay. So this is just a sample. This was on my resume from a while back when I was in a program chair position. And it sort of gives a little overview of what the job was about. And then it has these bullets of different quantified accomplishments. So here's one: collaborated with leadership team to identify and implement technology solutions and optimize resource capacity for the support of 183% year-on-year increase, and then I put the numbers there, in student numbers. And you'll see that every single one of these sort of bullet points, and they could be stated differently or better or more succinctly probably, but I quantified every single accomplishment in a percentage, a number, a percent increase, something that people can really understand. And what that does is it allows the reader to sort of believe you when you say that you accomplished something. If you put a number to it, it becomes a lot more tangible. People can hang their hat on it, and they get more interested in asking you more questions about it. So put some data in front of people in that resume and make sure that you're quantifying all of your accomplishments. And when I was working on this resume, I was working with a colleague, and they kept asking me how much, how many, what percent did this increase? Give me an estimate of, right? And so those are the kinds of questions you want to keep asking yourself. Now we're just about out of time for the presentation section, but I did want to stop before I continue on to my close. Any questions before we close up? If you have them, just put them in the box and I'll continue to close out here. So as I mentioned, I am the director of the Master of Applied Leadership and Management program. Thunderbird is ranked number 4 this year in International Business and U.S. News and World Report. We're excited to be a school of Arizona State University, which has been awarded the most innovative school for the 3rd year in a row. And the Master of Applied Leadership and Management program is a program that can be completed online. It's 30 credits. It can be completed in as little as a year. And it's focusing on sort of the leadership skills in international business contexts. And we're pricing it differently for where people live. and so we think that's exciting. We're looking to start with a small cohort of students in January, and we'd love to see you apply. Now, let me answer some of these questions. How's the MALM different than an MBA? Great question. So the MALM is the acronym for the Master of Applied Leadership and Management. And the MALM is different in that it is focused on that leadership side of things. So it's looking at soft skills. It's looking at, yes, you still have to take accounting, like you mentioned, and some of the titles of the classes are similar, but it's looking at, for example, accounting through the lens of leadership. It's also a curriculum that is shorter in length than a traditional MBA. So 30 credits is what the MALM is. Often MBAs are 45 or 50 credits, and so it's a shorter degree focused on leadership and looking at leadership through the lens of high growth and emerging markets. And so we're really talking about, decision making. How do you lead teams? How do you do project management? Yes, you do analytics still, and you still do accounting, and you still do finance, but the rest of the courses we're taking from a leadership angle, so you can apply that in practice in your workplace. Let me see, there's a couple other questions here. Yes, so in the MALM, the only essay that we require is for the scholarship opportunities, and so do use the tips that we talked about for the scholarship essay and application, and I look at each one of those applications as they come through. Jason asked, what % of students in MALM typically have previous work experience? So right now, most students do have some work experience, but this program is open to students coming out of an undergraduate program directly. If you don't have a lot of work experience, it's interesting to see sort of your story of why you want to come into the master's degree. It's also good. This degree is also good for students that might not have been a business major and want to come into a leadership and business degree. And so we encourage those applicants also. So to answer your question, most students have at least some work experience. But we're not turning away students that don't because we think that this is a good program for students who are going to start working and go to school at the same time. A couple more questions. Okay, I'm glad to stick around for a little bit longer and answer any more questions, but that's the presentation for today. Hopefully going over some of these tips of how to get into graduate school were helpful. And let us, please, Becca's typing below that we have some other events coming up, some other webinars. We'd love to have you. Please contact Becca or I. Our contact information is available if you have any questions about the Master of Applied Leadership and Management degree or any of our other degree programs or other programs here at Thunderbird. Thank you, everyone.